Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we really tear through the research stack to uncover the hidden frameworks that truly govern our world.
That's us.
Today, we are undertaking a pretty critical mission, understanding the invisible architects of human behavior.
Exactly. We're diving deep into these powerful currents of culture and social norms. Think of it this way. If public policy is the explicit instruction manual for how society should function,
Okay.
then culture is kind of the operating system, the deep, often unspoken, proprietary code that dictates whether those instructions are followed, ignored, or maybe even actively resisted.
Huh. It's the stuff we don't really think about until maybe someone from a totally different background points out how strange our habits are, right?
Yeah, or until a really well-intentioned policy like, I don't know, a national health mandate just completely collapses.
Because it ran headlong into some entrenched local tradition.
Exactly.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to gain a sophisticated, actionable understanding of how these deep-rooted cultural norms dictate societal behavior.
And how policies try to influence them. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not.
And maybe why cross-cultural sensitivity is like the single most essential ingredient for policy success.
Couldn't agree more. So to start, maybe we should nail down our core concepts, because these terms get thrown around a lot, often interchangeably, and it leads to, well, confusion.
Good idea. Let's start with the big one, culture.
Okay, culture. When we talk about culture, with a capital C perhaps, we mean the whole package, right? The comprehensive shared knowledge, beliefs, customs, rights, traditions, even the typical behaviors that differentiate one group of people from another.
And crucially, this isn't stuff we're born with.
Absolutely not. It's learned, it's socially transmitted, and it's really tightly linked to the observable actions of social groups. Culture basically provides the framework for meaning. It tells us what things mean.
Okay, so that's the big picture. But within that huge umbrella, say a national culture, we have smaller, identifiable groups that still have their own unique ways.
That's right. Those are the co-culture.
So cultures, right?
Yeah, a co-culture is essentially an identifiable subgroup that operates within a larger culture. They're often defined by things like profession, age, religion, or even something like communication style. Our sources actually highlight gender communication styles as a pretty clear example.
Ah, okay. But important clarification here. We're talking learned group behaviors, not something inherently biological about being male or female, right?
Absolutely vital point, yes. These are learned communication patterns associated with groups, not biological destiny.
So can you illustrate that a bit? What does a communication co-culture actually look like in action?
Sure. Well, think about the difference between what researchers have sometimes termed a masculine communication style versus a feminine one. Again, learned styles. The masculine style tends to be more focused on, say, efficiency, action, getting to the point.
The bottom line.
Yeah, the bare details of events, who did what to whom, what was the outcome. If someone's talking about a problem, this style often jumps towards finding a quick transactional solution.
Right, they want the fix. Okay, so what do we do about it?
Exactly. Now, conversely, the feminine communication style is typically described as more focused on relationship development and maintenance. So, when discussing an event or a problem, the speaker might spend more time dissecting the smaller relational dynamics.
How people felt, the impact on the connections between them.
Precisely how people felt, what the emotional cost was, how the interaction maybe impacted the bond between the participants. In a meeting context, the masculine style might prioritize a really clear bulleted agenda to get to a definite action item.
Check the box, move on.
Whereas the feminine style might prioritize more collaborative discussion, making sure everyone feels heard, even if it takes a bit longer to reach a decision.
Okay, that distinction is much clearer now. It's really about the goal of the communication solving the problem versus tending the relationship, not necessarily the sex of the person talking.
Exactly right. It's a learned co-cultural preference. And we see these co-cultures in other kinds of groupings too, like ethnic or regional clusters.
Like the example in the sources about Tibetan pastoralists.
Yeah, exactly. Think about the ethnically Tibetan pastoralists living in the Xinjiang area of China. They share these historically nomadic practices. They primarily speak the common Tibetan dialect. Now, they operate within the broader Chinese culture and legal system, obviously, but their specific livelihood, their language, their unique traditions, these definitely mark them as a distinct co-culture. And understanding these nuances is absolutely critical, especially when you're trying to develop, say, localized environmental policies, which we'll get into later.
This really brings us to Maybe the most important cognitive shift we need to make, both as hosts and for you listening,
Yeah.
acknowledging our own worldview.
Yes. Your worldview is that foundational perspective you hold, your sort of underlying assumptions about reality, time, morality, human nature, everything. And the thing is, we are all naturally prone to being egocentric.
Meaning self-focus. We just assume our way is the only way, or the normal way.
Right, often unconsciously. We assume everyone else thinks, perceives, and communicates exactly as we do, based purely on our own experiences and our own cultural context.
Which, statistically speaking, is almost always wrong.
Almost certainly, yeah. So the key to effective communication, whether you're talking international business, public policy, or heck, even just personal relationships, is moving past that ingrained egocentric stance. We need to become what our sources call a provisional communicator.
Okay, provisional communicator. What does that actually involve? How do you become provisional?
Well, it requires actively stepping away from your own perspective, just temporarily, and kind of putting your own assumptions on hold.
Suspending judgment.
Exactly. You need to appreciate that varied perceptions, values, beliefs exist out there, which are just as valid as your own, given the different cultural framework they come from. So instead of reacting with judgment like, ugh, that way of doing things is so inefficient, or that's illogical,
You pause.
you pause and you approach it provisionally. Okay, I understand that their priorities lead them to this choice, and I need to figure out the underlying reason. It's really the mental preparation we need before we can even start to look at a social problem objectively.
That's a really important framing device. Okay, so if we understand culture as the operating system and provisional communication as the mental approach, then we can look at the specific rules that culture enforces. And these are cultural norms.
Right. Norms are basically society's expectations for attitudes and behaviors. They provide predictability, they provide order, they act as these guidelines for daily interaction that, frankly, prevent social chaos.
They're the unwritten rules, mostly, like how close you stand to someone in line or how you greet someone.
Exactly. Everything from personal space to how you conduct a business negotiation, they just dictate what is considered appropriate in a given context.
And these norms aren't all equal, right? They exist on a spectrum of seriousness. Some are just customs, maybe polite conventions, but others are really deeply ingrained moral guidelines.
Right. Those are the mores, pronounced mores. Mores are the most serious category of norms because they dictate moral conduct and often relate directly to the welfare of the group.
So we're talking fundamental taboos or commandments.
Yeah, like thou shall not kill, or prohibitions against things like incest or serious fraud. When mores are held really strongly by a society, they often get formalized and enforced through law.
Ah, okay. So the law becomes the written, explicit manifestation and the enforcement mechanism for a deeply held cultural belief. Oh, more.
Precisely.
So let's recap quickly. Culture is the foundation, norms are the framework of expectations built on that foundation, and mores are the really strong moral pillars within that framework, often becoming laws.
Got it.
That brings us to the fundamental question for this deep dive.
Yeah.
Why are these things not just relevant, but absolutely central to how we think about creating and implementing public policy?
Yeah, that's exactly what we need to unpack next. We're diving into why you can basically never separate politics, policy design, and these deeply held cultural values. Because ultimately, culture determines success, it determines legitimacy, and it even sets the boundaries of political debate itself.
Okay, let's really dig into this foundational role of culture in policy. Looking back historically, why did scholars even start recognizing national culture as such a critical factor in fields like business or psychology? Was there a specific moment?
Well, it wasn't really a sudden aha moment, more like an empirical necessity that built up over time. For decades, researchers kept finding that models they developed, say, for motivation or leadership or group dynamics in one country, often just fell flat when they tried to apply them somewhere else.
Things just didn't translate.
Exactly. This growing recognition led to a focus on national culture as a key variable, especially in cross-cultural research and international practice. You see this formalized going back to seminal studies in international business and psychology, like the work Harris and Moran did back in 1979. Understanding these core values and preferences was seen as absolutely essential for making any kind of generalization or conducting sophisticated analysis that could actually predict human behavior across borders.
But isn't using a whole nation as the unit for defining a culture, well, inherently too broad? I mean, countries are famously diverse, right? Full of different languages, religions, ethnic groups all mixed together.
That is definitely the principal critique. And it's a really important one we have to acknowledge. Many countries, especially large federations or places with long histories of migration, are incredibly heterogeneous. Language, ethnicity, religion, geography, socioeconomic status, it's all mixed up.
So you might label a country as individualistic, but then find pockets within it that are highly communal.
Absolutely. So that simplification is a real risk.
So why do we keep using the national baseline then, if it's so messy?
Because despite those limitations, the concept still remains pretty useful, especially for sophisticated cultural mapping. It gives us a kind of baseline orientation of cultural values across different regions. It helps us identify, generally speaking, where a society tends to land on certain continuums, like, say, uncertainty avoidance or power distance.
It's a starting point.
It's a useful starting point. Plus, our sources do mention that some nations, like New Zealand, for example, are cited as being relatively homogenous. In those cases, the national cultural profile might be a more accurate and useful analytical tool. So it serves as a necessary shorthand, really, provided we always remember the internal complexity and don't treat it as monolithic.
Okay, so national culture is the useful, albeit imperfect, baseline. Let's get to the core argument then. Why do our sources insist that culture and these underlying values must be central to public policy thinking? They lay out 4 critical reasons, right? Like 4 pillars supporting this idea.
That's right. And these pillars really demonstrate that culture isn't just some passive backdrop that policy operates against. It's an active, incredibly powerful variable that shapes and sometimes determines every policy outcome. Ignoring it isn't just careless, it's arguably professional negligence for policymakers.
Okay, pillar number 1 seems the most straightforward. Policy success.
Correct. Fundamentally, value systems determine whether a policy actually achieves its stated goal. If a policy runs directly contrary to deeply held cultural values, it's going to face massive resistance, maybe even sabotage.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine trying to implement a policy based on radical individualism, something like mandatory user fees for all public parks in a culture that deeply values collective responsibility and shared community resources.
People would hate that.
Exactly. The policy might look economically sound on paper, but it's far less likely to be adopted or used or maintained properly, regardless of its technical merits. Culture essentially acts as a potential vetoed power on policy outcomes.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the second pillar moves beyond just whether the policy works technically to legitimacy and fairness. And this is where it gets really interesting, because legitimacy is presented as an outcome in itself.
Absolutely. Legitimacy, which is rooted in these deeper cultural norms about fairness and process, is an independent, desirable outcome. In any democratic system, or even just a highly bureaucratic one, a policy needs to be accepted as legitimate by the public. And that acceptance doesn't always directly correlate with, say, efficient economic outcomes.
People care about more than just the bottom line.
They care deeply, often culturally conditioned to care, about things like fair process, procedural justice, and respect for basic human rights standards.
And you're emphasizing here the difference in how people view their relationship with the government or public services.
Yes, exactly. People tend to view their relationship with public services not just as customers or users focused on getting the best deal for themselves,
But as citizens or members of the public.
right. A citizen perspective focuses more on whether the system is equitable for everyone, whether it upholds shared cultural standards of decency and fair play. They care about how those services treat other people and what the whole process says about the kind of society they belong to.
So even if a policy delivers a benefit, if the way it does, it feels culturally unfair or illegitimate.
It loses public support and can be successfully challenged. For example, if legal challenges demonstrate that legitimate cultural expectations around public consultation weren't met during the policy's development, it can be derailed, even if the intended outcome was good.
So fairness and legitimacy aren't just nice to haves. They are intrinsic cultural values with independent policy weight. Okay, the third pillar tackles managing tension.
This is crucial because policy debates are so often cultural battles in disguise. Democratic processes actually play a really important role in addressing the inevitable tensions between competing value systems within a society.
You mean like the really heated debates we see about things like LGBTQ plus rights or environmental protection versus economic growth or the role of women in the economy?
Exactly, those kinds of debates. They often emerge precisely when previously dominant value sets are being challenged by new social movements, demographic shifts, or changing economic realities.
So the political arena basically becomes the stage where these cultural negotiations play out.
Precisely. Ideally, the political process gives a voice and political rights to everyone on an equal basis. This inevitably brings these deeply felt cultural tensions out into the open, where they can be discussed, legislated upon, and hopefully managed peacefully.
But there's a risk there, isn't there? If people feel their core cultural identity is threatened.
That's the tension. Cultural identity is often much more salient, much more deeply felt for people than abstract democratic procedures. So if people truly believe the survival of their core cultural values is at stake, they might be tempted to bypass or undermine democratic processes.
Which makes the democratic framework itself even more important.
Absolutely. Its importance lies in ensuring these cultural disputes are channeled through peaceful mechanisms, prioritizing civility and established processes over coercion or violence.
Okay, and finally, the fourth pillar, the feedback loops. This is where it gets. Dynamic policy isn't just shaped by culture. Policy actively shapes culture in return.
That's a critical point. It's not a one-way street. Policy choices themselves affect the culture, and that altered culture then creates feedback loops that change the context for future policy decisions.
Our sources mentioned a specific hypothesis about individualism.
Yes, they analyze a hypothesized feedback loop involving individualism. The idea is, as a national culture becomes more individualistic, putting more emphasis on personal autonomy, self-reliance, it increases the cultural value placed on personal control and choice.
And what's the potential policy outcome of that cultural shift?
Well, the hypothesis suggests that this cultural shift can lead to greater public acceptance of, or even demand for, things like deregulation and the privatization of public assets and services.
Has it?
Because culturally, people might start to see state ownership or universal provision as inefficient, maybe paternalistic or constraining to their personal choice. They might prefer market-based solutions where they feel they have more direct control over the asset or service.
So the policy choice, say, privatization then reinforces the existing cultural value, individualism, creating this powerful self-reinforcing cycle.
Exactly. And similarly, the sources note that formal private property rights tend to develop more frequently and strongly in individualist cultures because the very concept of private ownership aligns perfectly with that cultural value of personal autonomy and control.
Wow. It really sounds like culture defines the boundaries of what's even considered politically possible, and then policy decisions can either expand or contract those boundaries over time. We can see this really vividly when we look at global views on national identity. What actually defines belonging for people around the world?
Yeah, global surveys provide some fascinating clarity here. When researchers ask people across dozens of countries what defines being a true national, a real member of the nation, certain elements have really high consensus globally.
Like language?
Language is huge. A median of 91% globally say speaking the main language is important. And sharing national customs and traditions is also very high, with a median of 81%. This suggests a kind of universal recognition that cultural artifacts and the ability to communicate within the culture are just central to identity.
But the interesting part is where the views differ, right? The
Yeah.
variance.
Precisely. Views on the importance of things like being born in the country or sharing the main religion vary quite significantly, especially when you compare high-income countries.
The U.S. is an interesting case here.
Very. Our sources point out that 37% of Americans place emphasis on being a member of the primary religion as important for national belonging. Now, that's a relatively high proportion compared to its high-income peers.
Like Australia or Sweden.
Exactly. Contrast that with Australia, France, Spain, or Sweden, where fewer than 25% think religion is important for true national belonging. So the U.S. seems to be a bit of an outlier among wealthy nations in how much it values religious identity as a core marker of national membership.
And ironically, the sources also mention the U.S. shows relatively low consensus on some other elements compared to the global median. Like, it has the lowest share of respondents saying speaking the country's most common language is important for belonging, at 78%.
Right. So the takeaway here is really crucial for policymakers. Culture defines identity, absolutely, but those definitions are not uniform, not even among nations that share similar economic status or political systems. Any policy related to integration, immigration, citizenship, or even social services has to navigate these deeply ingrained and sometimes contradictory cultural value systems very respectfully, because ultimately they determine who is perceived as an insider and who is an outsider within that society.
Before we move on to the nitty-gritty mechanics of norms, let's just briefly touch on the organizational context. Does this whole framework apply within, say, a single company or institution too?
Oh, absolutely. Organizational or workplace culture is basically just culture operating on a smaller scale. It's often defined as a commitment where every person, crucially including senior leadership, actively models the behavior that supports the organization's stated values.
So it's not just about the mission statement on the website.
Not at all. If you're researching a potential employer, or maybe even considering an investment, look past the glossy brochures. Look at empirical indicators like employee turnover rates or maybe retention rates among key groups.
Mhm.
High turnover, especially unexplained high turnover, almost always points towards a toxic or poor working environment.
Culture isn't about listing values.
It's about the CEO and the senior managers consistently modeling those values in their daily actions and decisions. If senior leadership doesn't actually embody the stated values, if they exhibit some alternative, maybe negative, co-culture of their own, then guess what? The entire organization will likely adopt that hidden norm instead, regardless of what the official handbook says.
Okay, so culture provides the macro structure, the operating system. Now let's zoom right in on the specific tools of influence within that system.
Hmm.
Social norms. When policymakers try to influence collective behavior, maybe encouraging vaccination or reducing energy consumption or getting people to waste less food, they really need to understand the mechanics of these norms, don't they?
Yeah.
Especially this distinction between what people actually do and what people approve of.
Yes, this is probably the most essential cognitive distinction for anyone designing a behavior change intervention. The difference between descriptive norms and injunctive norms.
Okay, break those down. Descriptive is.
Descriptive norms are simply your beliefs about what people actually do, what is typical, common, or average behavior in your specific social context. For example, most people on my street put the recycling bins out on Tuesday. It's just an observation of behavior.
Got it. And the injunctive norm.
Injunctive norms are your beliefs about what people approve of or want others to do. This is the moral or evaluative dimension. It's society's expectation that is met with social approval if you comply, or maybe disapproval, even punishment, if you deviate.
So sticking with the recycling example.
The injunctive norm would be, my neighbors expect me to recycle, and they would probably think less of me, or maybe even say something if I just threw all my plastic in the regular trash. It's about perceived social pressure.
And if a policy wants to be really effective in changing behavior, it needs to leverage both types of norms, ideally.
Exactly. When descriptive norms, people like me do this, and injunctive norms, people like me approve of this, align, the resulting social norm is vastly more powerful and much more likely to stick. You get this coordinated influence pushing in the same direction.
So if you're trying to discourage littering,
Right. Messaging that shows pictures of clean, litter-free parks, reinforcing a low descriptive norm of littering, and also emphasizes that community members strongly disapprove of people who litter, highlighting a high injunctive norm against it. That combined message will almost certainly be far more effective than just focusing on one or the other.
but norms can be tricky, right? They can persist, even when maybe most people secretly dislike them. This leads to what our sources call the collective illusion. That sounds problematic, like a societal trap.
It really is, and it's a powerful mechanism that often maintains the status quo, even an unhappy status quo. A collective illusion happens when a long-standing norm exists, not because most people genuinely support it or believe it's beneficial, but because individuals are afraid to openly question it.
Why? What are they afraid of?
Usually they fear social punishment or exclusion or just being seen as weird or disruptive. They wrongly assume that everyone else must find the norm acceptable or valuable. So this fear ensures conformity persists, even if the norm itself is disliked or outdated.
So, potentially, you could have a situation where almost everyone is silently unhappy with a norm, but publicly complies because they think they're the only one who feels that way.
Precisely. And there's a specific type of collective illusion that's particularly common and relevant in public policy and organizational settings. It's called pluralistic ignorance.
Okay, can you distinguish that one clearly from the broader collective illusion?
Sure. Pluralistic ignorance is the specific situation where most people privately disagree with a norm but comply because they incorrectly believe that the majority of other people actually support it.
They misread the room,
Yeah.
basically, on a massive scale.
Exactly. The classic example often cited in the research involves college binge drinking. Studies found that many less committed drinkers often drink more heavily than they actually want to,
Why would they do that?
simply to match what they perceive to be the descriptive norm. They believe everyone else is engaging in and approves of heavy drinking. But in reality, a large number of those other students might also privately prefer not to drink so much. They are literally ignorant of the fact that their private feelings are actually shared by many, maybe even the majority.
So the norm-heavy binge drinking is maintained almost entirely by this self-fulfilling prophecy of mass misunderstanding. Wow. Can you think of an easier, maybe everyday example that our listener might recognize, perhaps from their professional life?
Oh, absolutely. Think about those mandatory, really time-consuming weekly staff meetings that seem to achieve absolutely nothing productive.
Size. We've all been there.
Right. It's highly likely that most employees privately find them inefficient, maybe even dread them. But does anyone speak up? Usually not. Why? Because they assume the boss, or maybe the majority of key stakeholders, must secretly find these meetings beneficial. Otherwise, why would they keep happening?
They assume there must be a reason, even if they can't see it.
Exactly. But then, if one brave person, maybe we can call them the positive deviant, in this context, finally questions the utility of the meeting, what often happens?
Usually a flood of agreement. Oh, thank goodness someone said it.
Precisely, immediate collective agreement. That initial silence, that hesitation to speak up, that was pluralistic ignorance in action. The illusion is shattered the moment someone dares to voice the private opinion.
That really raises a fundamental question, though. Why are our brains so eager to conform in the first place? Is it just deep-seated social anxiety, fear of sticking out?
Well, there's definitely a social component, but there's also a strong cognitive driver, which neuroscience is helping us understand. Essentially, our brains are hardwired for energy efficiency.
Lazy brains.
Chuckles, efficient brains. Navigating novel social interactions, figuring out the right thing to do in every situation requires a lot of cognitive effort. Cultural norms, which basically tell us how to behave in thousands of predictable situations without having to think about it, they serve as incredibly useful energy-saving shortcuts.
Like mental macros.
Exactly. They provide the necessary context for social interactions, allowing our brains to operate much more efficiently on autopilot for routine stuff. This reliance, however, makes the act of questioning or challenging an established norm cognitively difficult. It forces us to expend precious mental energy to consciously override that automatic shortcut.
So challenging a norm is literally hard work for your brain.
It really is. And then, layered on top of that cognitive efficiency, conformity is also deeply linked to our social identity. Social identity theory basically states that a significant part of our self-concept comes from the groups we belong to. And conformity is driven in large part by identifying with a specific group. Group-specific norms function to minimize the perceived differences among group members, promoting uniformity and cohesion, and, at the same time, to maximize the perceived differences between the group and outsiders.
So acting like the group confirms my membership in the group.
Exactly. When you self-categorize as, say, a member of Team X or Community Y, you instinctively seek to align yourself with the typical dimensions, the norms that characterize that group.
And what happens if someone doesn't conform?
Well, therefore, a perceived lack of conformity, someone deviating from the group norm, is often viewed by the group not just as an individual quirk, but as a significant threat to the legitimacy and identity of the entire collective.
Which is why punishment for transgressors can be so swift.
Yes, things like ostracism, shaming, gossip, or even formal exclusion are activated to maintain the group's boundaries and its sense of internal uniformity, which it needs to survive as a distinct entity.
Okay, so that's the internal cognitive and social machinery driving conformity. Now let's look at the external complexity, especially when we try to move beyond research models developed primarily in Western contexts. Our sources include a really fascinating study on long-term manufacturer-supplier relationships, specifically in the Arab Middle East.
Yes, this is a crucial area because, as we mentioned, most relationship management research originates in Western contexts, which often tend to prioritize things like contractual clarity, legal enforcement, and transactional efficiency. This study, which focused on the Jordanian manufacturing sector, aimed to test how specifically Arab cultural values impact the development of long-term relationships, or LTRs.
And they didn't just test trust in general, did they? They looked at very specific cultural values.
That's the key. They tested 6 highly specific, really nuanced cultural values that are known to shape business interactions and trust in that region.
This is where we probably need to slow down a bit,
Yeah.
because these concepts might be quite distinct from typical Western business frameworks. Can you walk us through a few of those 6 values?
Certainly. They included, for instance, 1, Hifzama Waj, which translates roughly as saving face. This is about maintaining one's public dignity, honor, and reputation. In a business context, avoiding anything that causes shame or public embarrassment for yourself or your counterpart is absolutely paramount, and it can often override purely contractual efficiency.
So how you handle a disagreement matters as much as the substance.
Absolutely. Then there was 2. Wad, meaning promise. This refers to a commitment made, often orally, which carries immense social and moral weight, often far beyond its strict legal standing. Making a wad is a profound assertion of your trustworthiness and honor. Breaking it has serious social consequences.
More than just breach of contract.
Much more. And thirdly, 3, wasta, which translates roughly to who you know, or perhaps connections intermediation. This refers to leveraging personal connections, influence, or having someone mediate on your behalf to get things done. In many contexts, wasta is crucial for navigating bureaucracy, securing favorable deals, or resolving disputes. It functions as a necessary component of business operations, not just some optional casual networking.
Wow. So a business relationship isn't just about the product, the price, and the contract terms. It's deeply embedded in navigating these intricate layers of honor, personal commitment, and social networks.
Exactly right. The study also looked at tarof, the initial process of meeting and getting acquainted, karakadar, a sense of fatalism or destiny, and shura, a tradition of consultation. The main takeaway from this study was really twofold.
Okay, what's the first part?
First, it broadly confirmed the general consensus from other research. Yes, cultural values and thakika, which is the Arabic word for trust, are indeed crucial for building and maintaining long-term relationships in this context. No surprise there.
Okay. And the second, more complex finding.
The second, and perhaps more important, finding emphasized extreme context specificity. The way that Tuka Trust moderated the relationship between these specific cultural values and the strength of the LTR very significantly. It varied between the different cultural norms themselves, and it also varied between the two groups they studied, the manufacturers and their suppliers.
So trust didn't operate the same way for everyone or for every value.
Precisely. For example, while 5 of the 6 cultural values significantly influence the long-term relationship, the impact of tarof, that initial meeting and getting acquainted phase, was surprisingly not statistically supported in their model. This really shows that simplistic, generalized models, maybe models that just assume trust, is a monolithic concept, tend to fail when they confront these non-Western, highly context-specific cultural effects. You absolutely must understand which specific cultural lever you are pulling, why it matters in that context, and who you are pulling it for. Generalizations are risky.
That deep dive into specific culturally embedded values is really powerful. And we also see the influence of these deep-rooted norms affecting major social and life outcomes, especially around gender roles.
Yes, this is a major area where historical patterns and current cultural norms profoundly dictate status, opportunity, and life paths. Consider metrolocal societies, for instance. These are societies found historically in places like parts of Indonesia, where married couples traditionally move in with the bride's parents.
Okay, so the husband moves into the wife's family home.
Correct. Now, historically, this meant that the bride's parents had a strong incentive to invest significantly more in their daughter's education and well-being. Why? Because they knew she would remain nearby, contribute to the household, and likely provide care for them in their old age.
That makes perfect cultural and economic sense. You invest where the return is most likely to benefit you directly.
Exactly. However, one study highlighted in our sources found something fascinating. When the Indonesian government introduced a national pension program, which effectively decoupled old age support from direct parental investment in children, what happened?
Let me guess.
Yeah,
The parents started investing less in their daughter's education.
precisely. The study found that parents subsequently reduced that specific educational investment in their daughters. The moment the structural necessity of the daughter as the built-in retirement plan was potentially removed or lessened by the government policy, the cultural investment patterns began to shift, possibly back towards sons who might traditionally move away but could still be economically successful.
Wow. That's a stark illustration of how even well-intentioned policies can unintentionally undermine positive cultural norms if the underlying mechanism isn't fully understood.
It really is. Another crucial factor shaping gender norms globally is how financial transfers happen around the time of marriage. Societies that traditionally practice dowries, where there's a payment or transfer of wealth from the bride's parents to the newly married couple, or perhaps directly to the groom's family, tend to culturally value sons more than daughters.
Because daughters represent a net outflow of family wealth upon marriage.
Exactly. Conversely, cultures that traditionally practice bride price payments, where there's a transfer of wealth from the groom's family to the bride's family, are often likelier to see cultural and economic value in educating girls. Why? Because her education education, her skills, her potential contribution increases the value of the payment the family receives.
The economic logic reinforces the cultural value placed on daughters in that system. We also see the incredibly tenacious nature of history casting a long shadow over modern norms. The example given about Australia's early male-female imbalance is quite shocking.
It's a really stark reminder of how long historical accidents can echo. Australia's early non-Indigenous immigrant population was overwhelmingly male. This created a massive historical imbalance in the sex ratio that persisted for a long time.
Okay, and the long-term effect.
A study showed that even today, regions within Australia that historically experienced a greater male imbalance decades and decades ago are still associated with women today being statistically likelier to get married, less likely to work outside the home, and less likely to work in high-ranking occupations compared to regions with a more balanced historical ratio.
Even though the demographic imbalance itself corrected long ago.
Exactly. These trends persist long after the sex ratio evened out, demonstrating that cultural norms, once they become established, can be highly inertial. They develop a life of their own and resist change even when the original conditions that created them disappear.
But conversely, sometimes major economic shifts can dramatically alter those gender norms, sometimes for the better.
Oh, absolutely. When parts of China adopted technologies like the spinning jenny and power looms, women could suddenly engage in textile production at home and, in some cases, earn as much as or even more than their husbands working in agriculture.
Economic parity.
Yes. This newfound economic parity directly boosted women's status and value within the community. It often led to improved marital dynamics, greater say in household decisions, and sometimes better educational access for girls. Economic shifts can definitely reshape cultural norms. Similarly, instability, like greater cross-generational climate instability affecting agriculture, can sometimes undermine the importance placed on preserving rigid cultural traditions, including gender norms. This might lead to greater female participation in the labor force out of sheer economic necessity, forcing a change in traditional roles.
Okay, finally, before we move to policy interventions, let's just briefly connect culture directly to individual psychological well-being.
Right. Our sources mention a study comparing Taiwanese students and American students, specifically looking at the concept of contingent self-worth.
Contingent self-worth, meaning my feeling of self-worth depends on external factors.
Exactly. Depends on things like getting approval from others, achieving specific goals like high grades, or fulfilling obligations to family or social groups. The study found that in certain East Asian contexts, like Taiwan in this case, self-worth tended to be more highly contingent.
Which is often rooted in more collectivist cultural expectations, right? Emphasis on the group, fulfilling your role.
Yes, precisely. And the key finding was that when students felt their self-worth was much more dependent on these external factors, getting approval, meeting obligations, it was associated with significantly lower levels of personal well-being, higher stress, maybe more anxiety.
And this feeling of contingency was higher in the Taiwanese group.
Statistically, significantly higher in the Taiwanese student group compared to the American students in that study. This really demonstrates how these deep-seated cultural beliefs about our obligations, our responsibilities to others, and where our value comes from can directly influence our internal happiness, our stress levels, and overall mental health outcomes. The pressure to conform isn't just social or external, it can become internal and psychological.
Okay, so we have this incredibly complex, multi-layered system controlling behavior, everything from the energy-saving shortcuts in our brains to these intricate cultural rules governing international business deals. Now, let's tackle the really messy reality. Once a policy actually tries to engage with these powerful, often invisible norms, what typically happens?
Well, it's rarely smooth sailing. When policies attempt to influence social behavior, they almost inevitably face major hurdles. We're talking about predictable cultural resistance, sometimes significant ethical concerns, especially when the norms you're trying to change are deeply tied to people's personal or group identity, and of course, there's always the risk of unintended negative consequences.
So while policies offer concrete opportunities for governments to try and stimulate behavior change,
They absolutely must be managed with extreme caution and, crucially, a high degree of cultural literacy. Otherwise, you're just asking for trouble.
this brings us back to that policy norm feedback loop we discussed earlier, but this time focusing specifically on deliberate top-down attempts to change norms. How powerful can law actually be as a norm enforcer, and what makes it succeed when it does?
Law can be incredibly powerful, actually. It can fundamentally redefine societal norms over time by codifying new expectations and making the old norms illegitimate or illegal. Think about landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the United States or the Marriage Equality Acts that have been implemented across various nations more recently.
These didn't just change legal rights on paper.
Exactly. They didn't just change the legal landscape, they actively enforced new standards of fairness and protected previously vulnerable groups in a way that forced societal expectations to eventually, sometimes grudgingly, align with these mandated values of justice and equality.
So the law provides the necessary institutional backing, the official stamp of approval, to challenge the old, perhaps discriminatory or unfair norm.
Precisely. The law provides the powerful injunctive norm. This is what the state, representing the collective, now approves of and expects. And over time, especially when it's consistently enforced through educational systems, public institutions, and court decisions, this can gradually change the descriptive norm too, what people actually do and see others doing.
Probably the most powerful global public health example of this kind of massive, wholesale cultural shift, driven almost entirely by legislation, is anti-smoking policy, right?
Oh, it's the absolute paradigm case study. Over several decades, governments around the world systematically used a whole battery of legislative measures specifically designed to reduce the prevalence of smoking and protect public health.
This wasn't just one law, it was a whole suite of policies.
A whole stack of policy levers, exactly. This included widespread public smoking bans, especially in enclosed workplaces and public areas. It included strict restrictions, sometimes total bans, on tobacco advertising, promotion, and sponsorship. And critically, it included dramatically increased taxation on tobacco products.
Okay, so how did those different policies work together to actually shift the norm around smoking?
Well, each lever targeted a slightly different aspect of the previous pro-smoking or smoking-tolerant norm. The taxes, obviously, made the behavior economically punitive, hitting people in the wallet, which reduced consumption, especially among younger or more price-sensitive groups. The advertising bans worked to systematically degrade the status and the glamour that had been carefully cultivated around smoking for decades. But perhaps most critically, the public smoking bans in workplaces, restaurants, bars, public transport did two things simultaneously.
Okay, what were they?
First, they directly regulated exposure to passive smoking, protecting non-smokers. But second, and maybe just as importantly for norm change, they made the act of smoking itself highly inconvenient and socially marginalized.
By forcing smokers outside, often into designated less pleasant areas.
Exactly. It forced smokers outside, often huddled in the rain or cold, visually reinforcing the idea over and over again that this behavior was no longer accepted or normal within the shared public sphere. It physically separated the behavior from mainstream social interaction.
So it wasn't just about regulating the health risks of passive smoke. It was about regulating the social acceptability of the behavior itself in public spaces.
Hmm.
It transformed smoking from what was once a common, even stylish social act into something perceived as marginalized, maybe even slightly deviant, associated with inconvenience and negative health outcomes.
Precisely. This powerful combination of strong legislative enforcement, targeted taxation, and public health messaging fundamentally altered the social norms surrounding tobacco consumption. And the results are clear: significantly reduced smoking rates and vastly improved public health outcomes globally. It shows law can change culture.
And we see a similar, though perhaps more complex, and certainly still very controversial, attempt at a cultural shift in the U.S. with the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, or Obamacare. The argument is that this wasn't just a set of insurance regulations. It was intended as a cultural values statement.
Yes, the ACA is often cited as a profound example of how major public programs can attempt to deliberately shape core societal values. Before the ACA, you could argue that the predominant cultural norm for healthcare access in the U.S. was largely based on an individual responsibility model.
Meaning you get insurance through your job, or you buy it yourself, or maybe rely on charity if you can't afford it.
Right. Health insurance was generally viewed culturally more as a privilege that was earned through employment or personal wealth, rather than a basic right.
And the policy directly challenged that core cultural value.
It absolutely did. The ACA's implementation, despite all the political battles, dramatically increased health insurance coverage rates, reducing the number of uninsured Americans significantly. But beyond just the numbers, proponents argue it paved the way for a broader national culture change that increasingly views access to basic health care as a fundamental right of citizenship, rather than just a privilege.
So the political struggle over the ACA was, at its heart, a clash between competing cultural values, the individualistic value of self-reliance, versus the more collectivist value of ensuring universal welfare and shared risk.
That's a very good way to put it. And by embedding specific requirements like guaranteeing coverage for people with pre-existing conditions or requiring certain preventative services to be covered without copays, the policy structurally reinforced this newer norm of collective responsibility and shared risk within the healthcare system.
So the argument is it reduced financial burdens for many, helped families avoid crippling medical bankruptcies, and maybe shifted the policy focus a bit more towards community health and prevention rather than just reacting to crises.
Exactly. So policies like this can successfully embed new norms, or at least significantly shift the cultural landscape. But the risk remains incredibly high when you try to just pick up a policy that worked somewhere else and drop it into a new context. That brings us to the real danger of policy transfer risk.
Meaning taking an intervention or a policy model that worked perfectly well in country A and just importing it wholesale into country B without much adaptation.
Yes, and this is a recipe for potential disaster policy failure, wasted resources, and often significant local resentment. Policy success nearly always requires a careful, sensitive match between the cultural antecedents, the existing conditions and value systems in the place you're bringing the policy to, and the specific cultural dimensions of that recipient society.
So policymakers who are looking to adopt successful models from other countries.
They absolutely must undertake extensive cultural audits first. They need to understand the local norms, values, power structures, communication styles, everything. And then they need to be prepared to make significant, sometimes fundamental adjustments to the policy design to make it fit the new cultural context. If the underlying cultural value system doesn't align or actively clashes with the assumptions built into the imported policy, it's highly likely to be rejected, ignored, or subverted by the local population or implementing agencies.
This idea of cultural fit applies even to administrative structures within a single country, doesn't it? There's often political tension around decentralization of public services, like the debate in the UK over the so-called postcode lottery, where the quality or availability of a public service varies significantly depending on where you live.
Yes, that's a classic tension. National politicians, understandably, face immense pressure from the public and the media to deliver uniform, high-quality standards for essential services, regardless of geography. They are often held politically accountable for failures that happen at the local level. If a local hospital has problems or a local school fails an inspection, the national minister often gets the blame.
So the political argument pushes towards national standards, central control, more uniformity to ensure everyone supposedly receives the same level of service.
That's the political logic, yes. But the cultural perspective, based on the research we're discussing, argues against the very possibility of achieving true uniformity through top-down mandates alone.
Why?
Because if we accept the fundamental premise of our sources, that local culture significantly drives outcomes, and that the culture among service delivery agencies, like hospitals, schools, job centers, inevitably varies across the country due to local history, staffing, leadership, and community norms, then a postcode lottery, meaning significant variation in local service performance, is simply unavoidable.
So nationally imposed standards or performance targets won't just magically override the deeply embedded culture of those local delivery systems.
Very unlikely. The evidence often shows that the variation in actual performance, even within seemingly uniform national services like public employment centers or healthcare trusts, confirms this. Local cultural norms about efficiency, about equity, about how clients are treated often dictate the quality and fairness of service delivery far more powerfully than the national mandate or the official rulebook does.
So cultural variation implies that local outcomes will vary, almost inevitably, regardless of national legislative attempts to impose uniformity. That's a challenging message for national politicians. Okay, finally in this section, let's look at perhaps the most difficult norms to shift. Those surrounding violence, particularly things like violence against women or community violence.
Yes, this requires a really multifaceted and culturally sensitive approach. Insights from anthropology and public health tend to concur that the root causes of violence are deeply embedded in local power dynamics, in the normative use of violence. Is it seen as acceptable or even necessary in certain situations? And fundamentally, in the meaning of being a man or a woman, the established gender schemas within that specific society.
So harmful behaviors, like violence against women or intimate partner violence, become solidified by shared beliefs within the community that they are, if not acceptable, at least normal or perhaps inevitable.
Exactly. And these beliefs are often linked to other powerful norms, like norms around family privacy, which can tragically shield violence from public scrutiny or intervention, It's a private family matter.
Therefore, interventions that just focus on raising awareness or trying to persuade individuals one by one are unlikely to be enough.
Generally, no. Effective programs must target the deeper root causes. We see examples like Program H, the H stands for hombre in Spanish, homem in Portuguese, which operates across multiple countries. It focuses specifically on engaging men and boys in critical reflections about prevailing masculine gender norms.
How does it do that?
Through things like group education sessions, youth-led activism, media campaigns, it helps men and boys consciously rehearse new, more equitable attitudes and relationship skills in a safe, supportive environment. The idea is to help them internalize these alternative behaviors so they can live in a more gender equitable way. And if evaluation suggests this approach is associated with participants showing less support for gender and equitable attitudes and having improved health awareness, they are actively working to dismantle the internalized culture of power imbalance.
And the Silence Project in Africa, which we'll probably discuss more later, also explicitly addresses how violence is enabled and mediated by community-level norms. The takeaway seems to be that community-level norm change holds the greatest promise for substantially reducing interpersonal violence, especially in low-resource settings.
Absolutely. And often this involves addressing the structural barriers too, like inequalities in girls' education or economic opportunities for women. These interventions often need to start early in the life course during adolescence to shift expectations about status and power before harmful norms become too deeply entrenched. All right. Now that we've laid out the challenges and the deep resistance policies can face when they bump up against culture, let's explore what actually works. What are the successful strategies for trying to shift these deep-rooted norms? The absolute key finding consistently across our sources is that strategies must be highly, often hyper-specifically, culturally contextualized. There's no magic bullet.
Let's look straight at the study comparing food waste prevention messages in the U.S. and China. This seems to demonstrate really clearly why a one-size-fits-all, norm-based approach is doomed to fail.
It's a perfect illustration. Researchers designed messages aimed at reducing food waste. Some messages appealed to descriptive norms, many people are reducing their food waste, and others appealed to injunctive norms. People approve of reducing food waste. They deployed the exact same messages in both the US and China and measured people's intentions to reduce their own waste.
And the results were different.
Starkly different. The Chinese participants were far, far more susceptible to the normative influence than their American counterparts were.
So the Chinese participants looked at the same message and came away believing that preventing food waste was more common among their peers, descriptive, and more strongly proved as socially injunctive.
Exactly. Even though the informational input was identical, the cultural lens through which they interpreted that information led to a much stronger perception of the norm and, consequently, a stronger intention to comply with it.
Why? What explains that specific difference? Is it just collectivism versus individualism again?
That's likely a huge part of it. Chinese culture is often characterized by higher levels of collectivism compared to the US, and also a strong cultural emphasis on maintaining face public honor, avoiding shame. This generally makes individuals much more attuned to the expectations and behaviors of their relevant peer groups. The fear of social sanction or shame or just not fitting in, which is a powerful injunctive norm component, tends to be stronger on average than in the more individualistic American context, where personal autonomy is often prized more highly.
Okay, so if the persuasive appeal relies heavily on the belief that my neighbors are doing this and they expect me to do it too, that mechanism has a kind of natural cultural amplifier in China that might be much weaker or even absent in the US.
Exactly. The descriptive and injunctive norm appeals simply had a much stronger impact on behavioral intentions among the Chinese participants because their underlying cultural framework amplified the perceived power and relevance of the social norm itself. This confirms really powerfully that effective norm-based interventions are highly dependent on cultural context. You absolutely must calibrate the intensity and the specific type of normative messaging based on how strongly the local culture values conformity, collective opinion, and social harmony versus individual choice.
Okay, so we need to tailor the message. Moving from tailoring messages to tailoring the entire solution itself, let's look at one of the most famous and arguably successful examples of community-driven social change: the positive deviance case study in Vietnam concerning child malnutrition.
Ah, yes. This is such a classic, powerful example of how to break a collective illusion, essentially from the inside out, using existing community resources. The background is that several decades ago, many rural villages in Vietnam faced chronic, severe child malnutrition despite available food resources.
And the standard approach didn't work.
No. Traditional top-down, expert-driven solutions like sending in foreign nutritionists to tell villagers what they should be feeding their children failed repeatedly. They ran smack into entrenched local traditions, economic constraints, and probably just resistance to outsiders telling them what to do.
So the experts would leave, and the problem would remain. How did the positive deviance approach change that dynamic?
The positive deviance, or PD, approach mandates starting from a completely different place. Instead of looking for problems, you look within the community that's suffering for the people who are already succeeding despite facing the exact same challenges and constraints as everyone else. You look for the positive deviance.
The outliers who are doing well against the odds.
Exactly. These are the individuals whose uncommon but beneficial behaviors allow them and their families to thrive while their neighbors with the same resources struggle. They are violating the prevailing negative norm, but in a good way.
And in this specific Vietnam case, the crucial deviant behavior violated a deep cultural belief, the collective illusion about shrimp, wasn't it?
That's right. There was this deeply held, pervasive cultural norm, essentially a collective illusion that young children shouldn't eat certain locally available foods, particularly small shrimp and certain types of greens found in the rice paddies. The belief was that these foods would cause diarrhea or other illnesses in young children.
Well, some mothers were feeding these foods to their kids.
Yes. The PD inquiry discovered that the mothers of the few well-nourished children in these poor communities were actually gathering these tiny shrimp and greens and adding them to their children's meals, providing crucial protein and micronutrients. But, and this is key, they were often doing it in secret.
Why secretly?
Because they knew they were violating that powerful cultural norm. They feared judgment or criticism from their neighbors or elders. They were the positive deviants, succeeding quietly by breaking the rule.
So what was the intervention then?
Yeah.
It wasn't enough to just identify these mothers and tell everyone else, hey, feed your kids shrimp, right? Because that failed before.
Absolutely not. The intervention focused almost entirely on amplifying the voices and practices of these positive deviant mothers themselves. They organized community-based cooking and nutrition sessions where these successful mothers were invited, maybe even celebrated, and encouraged to openly share their secret practices with their neighbors.
So the learning came from peers, not experts.
Critically, yes. By allowing the local people, the peers, to reveal the truth to each other, that the supposedly forbidden behavior was actually beneficial, and that other respected members of their own community were already doing it successfully. The group's pluralistic ignorance and the collective illusion just crumbled. People realized, oh, wait, she's doing it and her kids are healthy. Maybe that old belief isn't true.
The fear of judgment disappears when the behavior becomes visible and validated by peers.
Exactly, and the social change happened remarkably quickly at what the researchers involved described as an unimaginable pace. It resulted in dramatic and, importantly, sustainable nutritional gains for children across hundreds of villages, all achieved using only local resources and local knowledge. The solution was already present within the community. The restrictive cultural norms were the main barrier holding it back.
That sounds like the absolute key to unlocking authenticity and change in many situations, creating conditions that allow people to safely reveal who they really are and what they secretly believe or do to each other. That visibility makes the illusion collapse very quickly.
That really is the power of working from the community inward, leveraging existing strengths. And often this requires identifying and maybe targeting the deeper levers within the culture that influence not just one, but multiple norms. These are sometimes referred to as meta-norms.
Okay, meta-norms. What exactly constitutes a meta-norm? How is it different from a regular norm?
Think of meta-norms as the underlying social elements, maybe the structural foundations or core ideologies that shape or influence multiple specific social norms related to a particular domain.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Generalized gender ideologies, the deeply ingrained cultural beliefs about the proper roles, capabilities, and value of men versus women are a powerful metanorm. This underlying ideology then influences numerous specific derivative practices and norms. Things like attitudes towards child marriage, the expected distribution of domestic labor, acceptance or tolerance of gender-based violence, access to education for girls versus boys, etc. Addressing the metanorm, the core gender ideology, can potentially shift the whole cluster of related specific norms. Other examples might include fundamental power dynamics between groups, accepted systems for conflict resolution, or dominant decision-making patterns within a community.
Okay, that makes sense. A great example highlighted in the sources of successfully targeting a metanorm is the SASA program in Uganda, which focuses on preventing violence, particularly against women.
Yes, SASA is a really well-regarded community mobilization strategy. What's interesting is that it explicitly addresses the fundamental power balance or imbalance between men and women as the core metanorm driving violence.
And they use accessible language, right?
Mm.
Not academic jargon.
Very intentionally. They tend to avoid highly academic or technical terms like gender-based violence or patriarchy. Instead, they use simple, powerful, easily understood words like power, power over versus power with, action, and change. This allows community members to engage with the concepts easily and personally without feeling intimidated or lectured.
So how does this strategy translate into actual actionable change on the ground?
It primarily uses what they call a local activism strategy. This involves grassroots activities driven by community members themselves, things like community dialogues, public events, informal quick chats between neighbors, maybe even using local drama or storytelling, all designed to get people talking and thinking critically about how power is used in relationships and how that relates to violence.
So they don't just talk about violence, they address the underlying accepted power structures that make violence possible, even seem normal.
Exactly. And crucially, SASA generally employs a positive framing approach.
Meaning they don't lead with blaming men or using scary statistics.
Correct. Instead of focusing heavily on blame or using fear-based negative messages, SASA tends to take a more benefits-based approach. It encourages community members, both men and women, to think about the positive effects of achieving a better power balance in their relationships and communities. Things like better family life, reduced stress, increased community safety, and cohesion.
So it's aspirational, focusing on the good that comes from change.
Yes, and this grassroots community work is often complemented by advocacy efforts aimed at influencing local leaders, service providers, and maybe media campaigns, thereby trying to create a more supportive institutional environment for the new, healthier metanorm of balanced power to take root and be sustained. Its success in reducing rates of violence demonstrates that transforming these deep power imbalances, a core metanorm, can fundamentally reshape specific harmful behaviors like interpersonal violence.
Okay, finally, let's loop back quickly to the Tibetan pastoralist study we mentioned earlier. This example really reinforces the importance of targeting the immediate community, the proximal groups, for norm change efforts.
Yes, that study focusing on conservation behaviors among Tibetan pastoralists in the Sanjiangwen area, specifically the need for them to reduce the size of their herds to protect severely degraded grassland quality, which is critical for their long-term survival, had a really vital finding for implementation.
Which was?
The researchers found that individuals had much clearer, stronger, and more consistent normative expectations about these conservation behaviors, like reducing herd size, when the referent group they were asked about was physically or psychologically proximal to them.
Okay, what does that proximal group actually look like in their specific case?
In their case, it was the small, tight-knit herding group. This typically consisted of just a handful of families who share the same immediate grazing areas, interact on a daily basis, manage livestock collaboratively, and whose economic fate is visibly interconnected. When pastoralists were asked about the expected conservation behavior among this small herding group, their responses were clear and there was high consensus. They knew what the others in that group expected.
But when they were asked about the wider community?
Exactly. When they were asked about the normative expectations for the wider village group, a larger, more dispersed entity, the responses became much more ambiguous. There were many more not sure answers, less consensus. The norm felt weaker, less defined at that broader level.
This really highlights the crucial difference between a theoretical community, like the village, and a truly functioning day-to-day reference network.
Absolutely. The lack of clarity they found for the wider village-level norm was critical. It strongly stresses the importance for policymakers and program designers of targeting the immediate reference network when trying to shift norms. For effective, clear, and consistently reinforced change, social norm researchers and practitioners really need to map out these immediate social networks. They need to ensure they are targeting the right participants and identifying the key influencers within those proximal groups who will consistently model and reinforce the new desired norms, rather than just broadcasting messages to an abstract, large, and potentially less influential group like the whole village or the entire nation. It's about finding the right scale for influence.
Wow, this has really been a true deep dive into the hidden machinery of how society operates. Let's try to synthesize what we've learned here. I think the overarching message that comes through loud and clear is culture isn't just some passive backdrop or context for policy. It is the active engine driving policy success or failure, determining legitimacy, and ultimately enabling or blocking social change.
Absolutely. Ignoring the underlying value system, whether in public debate or in the fine print of policy design, is very likely a recipe for failure. We saw this across so many different domains we discussed. Think about the difficulty of implementing standardized international guidelines for something like early childhood education. They inevitably face deeply ingrained, diverse cultural values about child rearing and education in different countries.
Or the example of national standards failing to truly override the local culture of service delivery.
Exactly. If the local culture among frontline staff dictates inefficiency or maybe prioritizes certain groups over others, a national standard written down in a document hundreds of miles away can't magically fix that on its own. The local operating culture often trumps the national rulebook.
And this means we really have to move beyond focusing solely on the technical details when we discuss or design policy. We saw that policy debates often need to consciously shift their language away from just the technical implementation specifically, the costs, the delivery mechanisms, the empirical efficiencies.
And shift towards the fundamental values at stake.
Yeah. We need to change the conversation sometimes and ask the bigger question. What does this policy actually say about our shared vision of what constitutes a good society?
Right. When a political process becomes, as it often does, fundamentally a public debate on competing values, like we saw with healthcare, being framed as a right versus a privilege, rather than just a technical discussion about the best means to achieve an already agreed upon end, then the language of that debate absolutely must shift to reflect that fundamental cultural clash.
Because if you focus the conversation only on the economics or the technology or the logistics,
You completely miss the point of how people are actually listening. You miss what deeply held beliefs they hear being affirmed or maybe threatened by the policy proposal. You're not speaking to their cultural core.
what's really fascinating here, though, is the apparent dual nature of these norms. On the one hand, they seem incredibly tenacious, right? Driven by these deep cognitive efficiency needs and our powerful drive for social identity and belonging. They resist change forcefully.
Very resistant.
Yet on the other hand, they seem simultaneously susceptible to sudden, sometimes dramatic collapse, particularly when those collective illusions we talked about are finally broken.
And that, I think, is our provocative takeaway thought for you, the listener, to mull over after this deep dive. While public policy can sometimes successfully embed new norms, think about the anti-smoking legislation eventually making non-smoking the default, or the ACA arguably shifting the needle on healthcare as a right.
The underlying power of many social norms still relies on that widespread, often misperceived consensus to maintain their hold.
Exactly. So the key challenge, maybe the key opportunity for you, is to try and identify the collective illusions that might be currently operating in your own professional sphere or maybe your civic life or even your community.
You mean look for those seemingly unshakable norms or traditions or ways of doing things that you suspect most people actually secretly disagree with or find burdensome, but they continue to comply with anyway.
Yes, complying out of fear or misplaced politeness or just the incorrect assumption that everyone else must surely support it. Look for the customs, the routines, the unquestioned assumptions that feel arbitrary or inefficient, or maybe even slightly absurd, but persist nonetheless. Because, as that Vietnam positive deviance example proved so powerfully, challenging those illusions often just by finding ways to elevate the voices of those who are already deviating positively, those quiet outliers can allow social change to happen at a truly unimaginable, surprisingly rapid pace. The illusion shatters and the path clears.
But it requires vigilance. It requires the willingness to actually question that perceived consensus, even when, as you said, our own brains are kind of hardwired for conformity, for taking the easy normative path.
Right. If our brains are naturally inclined towards those energy-saving shortcuts, then the conscious act of questioning the norm, of asking, wait, why do we really do it this way?
Hmm.
That is perhaps the highest and maybe the most energy intensive, but also potentially the most impactful form of critical thinking we can engage in.
So look for the norms that lurk in the background, the ones we take for granted, especially those that feel arbitrary and seem to lack a clear, current, functional purpose.
Because those are often the most likely candidates for being collective illusions, just waiting for a small push to collapse and allow necessary change to finally happen.
That is a fascinating challenge to leave our listeners with. That's a wrap on this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us as we explore the absolute centrality of culture and social norms.
It was a great discussion. Until next time.